In today's session, we're going to discuss the early days of country music. I'm calling this Tales of Destruction and Fiddling Contests, and there's a good reason for that, obviously. The Tales of Destruction, one of the things that's very popular in the aughts and teens and 20s were these disaster songs. These were songs about events like the Jenkinstown flood or the sinking of the Titanic, or even little boys falling down wells and being rescued, and so on. These were real events that are then sort of mythologized in song, and sometimes these were events that had just occurred, and somebody writes a song about it. And this was a mainstay of early country music, as we'll see. And then the fiddling contests, I suppose that's also somewhat obvious, but the very beginning of country music had to do with these fiddling contests, as we'll see with fiddling John Carson, who again we're in a very similar position to the position we were in with blues music, that there was thought to be no market for this kind of stuff, that at best it would be a relatively small and unprofitable market. And as it turned out, there was a huge market for country music, and in fact, country music is one of the great growth industries of U.S. music. And we'll see that from the time that we have the earliest recordings in the 19 teens and 20s to the really explosion of popularity in country music in the World War II era, and obviously we'll be dealing with all of that this semester. So let's turn to some issues that have to do with early country music and its recordings. The term hillbilly first appears in print on April 23rd, 1900. That's actually a little late, you might think. You might be kind of surprised that, in the 19th century, they didn't really have this term hillbilly. It appeared in the New York Journal, where it is reported that, quote, a hillbilly is a free and untrammeled white citizen of Alabama who lives in the hills, has no means to speak of, dresses as he can, talks as he pleases, drinks whiskey when he can get it, and fires off his revolver as the fancy takes him. So notice this person is being described as free and untrammeled, right? So in one sense, the hillbilly is representing the kind of liberty that is idealized in the United States, this idea of individual liberty. So notice that some of the same concerns with individual liberty that some people espouse today, the idea of one's Second Amendment rights, for instance, figure into this description, right? But there's also these ideas of kind of, uh, you know, the kind of masculinity we've been talking about before with the drinking of whiskey, the talking as one pleases, not necessarily observing social niceties, and then also dressing. There's also this idea of a kind of impoverishment, right? That this person is probably not the most well-off person. The term may be, there's no way to prove it, but it may be a combination of two Scottish colloquialisms, the idea of hill folk, literally people who live in the hills, and then Billy. The first is deprecatory for a Presbyterian rebel against Charles II. So they were in the hills because they're hiding. This is in Scotland, obviously. They're hiding from the authorities, basically. But a billy in Scottish lingo simply means a companion, a comrade, or a mate. So a hillbilly is a friendly person or somebody that you have as a friend who lives in the hills, in that sense. This is a figure that we're going to be talking about a lot in the coming sessions. We've already mentioned his name. He was a recording engineer, an assistant recording engineer in the 1920 OK recording of the City Blues song "Crazy Blues" by Mamie Smith. He's also the person that coined the phrase race music, right? And he's also going to coined the phrase hillbilly music, and these will be his two labels really for OK. This is what made OK Records what they were. Really, they had some more mainstream recordings, but those weren't the ones that sold well. That's not what made their reputation. What made their reputation was their race record series and their hillbilly record series. In other words, blues music and black based music in general, and then country music on the other hand. And that's another phrase that, as far as we know, he's the one that starts calling this music that, right? And he's certainly the one that starts making it a regular label for advertisements and for lists of products, merchandise that one might buy. So, hillbilly music is a synthesis, really, of folk and mass culture. And that's something that's important to remind ourselves of. We saw last time Frances Densmore, who was an archivist, and she's going around recording Native Americans and trying to preserve this traditional sound. That's not what Ralph Peer's up to. Ralph Peer's trying to sell commercial music, right? So this is folk influenced music, but he's shaping it and he's having his artists shape it to be these, 2.5 to 3 minute performances that'll fit on the side of a record, that have a certain shape, that have a certain form to them, that are engaging, that will be popular, right? So keep that in mind, that we're not talking about some kind of pure folk expression here. We're talking about a synthesis of folk and mass culture. So on the one hand, it derives from folk songs, from ballads and dance music of the British immigrants. But on the other hand, it's deeply influenced by vaudeville, minstrelsy, radio, and recordings. So we already said that he was a recording engineer for OK. He's the first to take a portable recording studio to the South in 1923. He's the first to do this commercially. We saw that Frances Densmore was already doing it in the 19-teens, and so were some other ethnomusicologists. But he's the first to do this as a commercial enterprise. He's also credited with the first country hillbilly music recording, and he's the one that uses that term hillbilly, right? Supposedly he got it from the hillbillies as a marketing term, and we'll talk about them in just a second. He was friends, Ralph Peer was friends, or at least had business interests, with Polksy Brockman. Brockman was an Atlantic record dealer, and he met with Peer in New York City. And in June of 1923, he's in the Old Palace Theater on Times Square, and he's watching a newsreel. And in the middle of the newsreel is this Virginia fiddlers competition. And he thinks about a fiddler that he knows back in Atlanta named Fiddling John Carson, who does all those fiddling contests. He goes all around doing them. And here you can see Fiddling John Carson. He's the one holding the violin, obviously. The other fellow on his, kind of kneeling down, that's Brockman. Just so you can see him, that's him in the middle of a recording session, obviously. And he writes down in his notebook, Fiddling John Carson, local talent, let's record, right? So he figures he has access to this guy, and he's going to try to convince Ralph Peer to record him. At first, Ralph Peer's not that interested. And then, basically Brockman says, well, look, you've been doing the race records thing for the past 3 years, and that's turned out pretty well for you. Let's try something else. So they make an appointment to go down to Atlanta. And this is the Nassau Street sessions. So there are two really important Ralph Peer sessions that we're going to talk about, both having to do with country music, and they're both remote recordings, obviously. They didn't take place in New York. They're Ralph Peer bringing some of his equipment, the portable equipment, down to these locations. The first famous one is the Nassau Street sessions. On June 12th of 1923, the Atlanta Journal ran the following advertisement. Canned music, right? That somewhat pejorative term for recorded music. Recorded by local musicians, will be made for the first time in Atlanta by the OK Company of New York. It was announced Friday by R.S. Peer, so that's Ralph Peer, obviously. Production manager, he's gotten a promotion by this point. Production manager of the company, who is completing arrangements here for the recording of selections by a number of local musical organizations. About 30 recordings will be made at the laboratory of the company on Nassau Street. It's not a laboratory, it's a hotel room that they're renting out, and they just set up in the hotel room, including selections by the Morehouse College Quartet of Negro Singers. So he's still building on the race records thing, but also Fiddlin' John Carson, the Seven Aces, and other organizations, which just means other groups. Manufacture of the records here is made possible by a recording machine recently invented by an engineer of the OK Company, which lowers the high cost of producing the records away from the home laboratories. So these are the Nassau Street sessions. Basically, it sounds a little more organized than it really was. What Peer did is he told Brockman to find as many local musicians as he could, And he was mostly interested in race music. So he was mostly interested in the college quartet and groups like that, right? So he wanted more blues. He wanted more African American singing, these choral groups and so on. Brockman didn't want that. Brockman really wanted to emphasize these country music artists. He thought that they would sell, certainly they would sell locally. But Peer, you would think that Peer learned his lesson from race music and how well that did for him. But he was resistant at first. He wasn't so sure that the same thing would happen when it came to what we think of as country music and what he thinks of as hillbilly music. But here you can see some of the advertisements for the OK Records at this time. This is when they're releasing Fiddlin' John Carson. You can also see the Seven Aces. They were mentioned in that thing that we just talked about. And then you also see Lucille Bogan. This is, of course, not Shave 'Em Dry, which was a party record. But she was also on OK Records at this time. So these are ads for OK Records. Carson recorded on June 14th. And he recorded Fiddlin' John Carson, and he called it Pluperfect Awful, which I always think is one of the great insults in music history. Those of you who study Latin or certain other languages, you know that the pluperfect is the past of the past. So it's when you say, English has it too, it's when you say had been or something, right? So it's not just that it was, it's that it's over now. It had been. So it's something that's done in the past, not something done recently or that might be ongoing from the past or was done often in the past. It's something that's over now and is that far in the past. So to call something pluperfect awful is saying that the awfulness of it is all done. It's all closed. It's as awful as it was ever going to get. It's more than perfectly awful. But Carson, he was already famous in that area. On March 16th, 1922, the Atlanta Journal, so before these recordings, the Atlanta Journal had established the WSB with a 100-watt radio transmitter as the first commercial broadcasting unit in the South. So Atlanta had the first real broadcasting radio station in the South as a whole. By June 13th, it increased power to 500 watts. And by September 9th of that year of 1922, Carson made his debut as part of a novelty program. So he's been playing on the radio for several years at this point. A couple years at this point. So Peer wasn't expecting to make money from Carson, but Brockman offered to buy 500 copies right now. Right after it was done, right? And Peer figured, well, this is about as good as it's going to get. So he issued it as an uncatalogued special without a label number. So in other words, he didn't expect really to sell this thing. Remember, all the records have these label numbers. We saw that with the Victoria Spivey that we looked at, where you have the actual number and you could order it. Certainly merchants would order it through that catalog number. He didn't even give it one because he didn't think it was going to sell. He sold the 500 to Brockman and figured that would be the end of it. But Brockman was smart. What he did was he sold these records at the various fiddlers conventions. So people are all hyped up to hear these great fiddlers, and John Carson wins a lot of these conventions. And so when he won, Brockman's right there to sell these things as kind of mementos, right? And it was so popular, it was so successful that by November, just a few months later, Carson was in New York recording 12 more tunes because the recordings have been selling out. This uncatalogued at first recording. Now you have some other claimants to the beginnings of country music. You have Henry Witter, who you see up there with his guitar. He claims his first session with OK preceded Fiddlin' John's. He says it was in March of 1923, but those recordings didn't survive. He claims that Fred Hager, I don't know if you remember who that is, but he was the main recording engineer at OK, and it used to be that Ralph Peer worked for him, and then Ralph Peer got a promotion. But at any rate, supposedly Fred Hager just had those recordings destroyed. He wasn't very interested. So the first recordings by Witter that actually survive are from December of 1923, so after Fiddlin' John, through 1926. And the first session that survives included the wreck of the old Southern Old 97, which is a disaster song. It's about a train wreck, right? That Witter either wrote or participated in writing. The recording was fairly successful, but then it becomes a huge hit when the light opera singer, and that's who you see in the bottom corner there, Vernon Dalhart, recorded it in 1924. So this is he sings light opera, he sings operetta, right? So he has a very trained voice, and it's a voice that records very well. And he sort of fakes a little bit. When you listen to this, you'll hear he fakes a little bit of an accent. But Dalhart becomes kind of an expert in a way in these disaster songs and these early country songs. In 1925, he records The Death of Floyd Collins, which is one of these another sort of murder ballad, basically. Or wait, The Death of Floyd Collins might be the one where he's down the well. I don't remember. You'll listen to it and remind me. But it basically, he establishes the country exploitation event song, right? So you're taking these sad events and you're exploiting them for songs. And the lyrics for that one, The Death of Floyd Collins, were by Reverend Andy Jenkins. And he became kind of an expert in these things. He wrote a lot of these songs. And people would, basically, he would get the newspaper every day and just scan them for events that he thought could be made in the songs and then sell them to publishing companies. So you see that the beginnings of country music have to do with fiddling contests and with these disaster songs, these murder ballads and disaster songs. Here are the Hillbillies, the country group that more or less gave the genre its name at first. In February of 1925, a supplement announced the new release, Silly Bill and Old Time Cinda. And you can see the number there. This one did get a release number by the Hillbillies. And this was a group of people from the Galax, Virginia barbershop. They basically played in a barbershop for local entertainment and just to sort of be together and play songs. And they auditioned for Ralph Peer, and he says, "Well, what do you guys call yourselves?" He goes, "I don't know." One of the members said, "I don't know. We're just a bunch of hillbillies from Galax," and that's what Ralph Peer wound up having his secretary put on the issue of the record. They weren't too happy about that for a little bit, and then they sort of decided to own it and kept that name. So basically, the new Old Times Tunes Special Catalog, the second, in April of 1925, announced a new disc by the group, Cripple Creek and Sally Ann, and this was a pretty big release for them, and they announced the release with the following: "Here, folks, the music of the hillbillies. These rollicking melodies will quicken the memory of the tunes of yesterday. The heart beats time to them, while the feet move with the desire to cut a lively shine. These here mountaineers sure have a way of fetching music out of the banjo, fiddle, and guitar that surprises listeners, old and young, into feeling skittish. Theirs is a spirited entertainment and one you will warm to." So notice, there are several things here, right? There's this emphasis on nostalgia, that these tunes will quicken the memory of tunes of yesterday. They don't say that they are the tunes of yesterday, although Cripple Creek and Sally Ann, those are both traditional tunes, but their version of it might not be exactly the music of yesterday. But it will quicken memories of the tunes of yesterday. And then also there's this emphasis on the sort of functionality of it. You can dance to it, right? You'll have a desire to dance to it. But also notice that they have a way of fetching music, right? So they're drawing it out. Now you might feel that I'm making too big of a deal out of that, but there's this sense here that they're almost natural. It's coming naturally to them, right? Okay. Another big group was the Skillet Lickers, and you can see the guitarist Gid Tanner there. He's the one that's looking straight at the camera. His eyes look a little funny there because he's blind, right? Another of these blind guitarists. He's incredibly important. Actually, the Skillet Lickers in general are a very important group, even more than the Hillbillies. And this was Columbia Records entering into the hillbilly market, right? They already followed OK Records into the race market, and now they're entering into the hillbilly market with the Skillet Lickers. And this is in 1926, so 3 years after OK Records. This group is a little more old-fashioned than many of the other acts. They're very influenced by vaudeville and minstrelsy. Listen to their Soldier's Joy, and you'll hear that it begins with a bit of patter, right? Creating an idealized vision of a dance held in one's living room. So they say, go ahead and move the good rug, for instance, right? Get that good rug out of the way. And so just like if you went to a country barn dance, the leader would call out things, call out the moves that you make, get you ready for the dance. They're doing that, right? So the idea is to create this kind of experience in a way, or to create the semblance of a kind of experience. The tune, though, when you actually listen to it, and Soldier's Joy is a classic, which I'll talk a little bit about in the podcast episode, but it's too fast. Their version is too fast for most social dancing, so it probably wouldn't be used that way. So the point isn't here that you're actually meant to put on the record and dance to it, although I suppose you could if you're good or energetic, but it's really more of a representation that is supposed to be better than reality, faster, more intense, more down home, more traditional than traditional, right? And so there's an invention in a way of tradition that goes on with this early country music. There's this attempt, just like we saw with race music, just like we saw with blues, there's an attempt to capture this audience based on nostalgia, based on this desire to capture what is now lost, or perhaps what never completely was. This is in November of 1925, so right in the midst of all this is when George D. Hay starts a 1-hour barn dance program on WSM radio station in Nashville that he calls the Grand Ole Opry. The Grand Ole Opry is now the longest running radio broadcast in U.S. history. In the 1930s, it becomes a 4-hour show, so it becomes this huge variety show, and we'll talk about it more when we get to the 40s, but it begins incorporating elements of literature in the sense of telling these stories of comedy. There's stand-up comedy. There are all sorts of different musical acts. There can be little playlets and so on. It's a variety show, and it really starts this tradition on the radio of these barn dance shows, where again you're broadcasting throughout the nation. Right? These shows become nationally popular, even among some people who spent basically no time in the South, or were certainly not raised in the South. But it gives you this sense of an idealized, down-home, farm-based, agrarian America. And so a lot of what goes on in the 20th century, following from the 19th century, is this idealization of a life that most people, certainly in the early 20th century, are not living. This agrarian life, this life tied to the land, right? Many people, especially by the time we're getting to the 20th century, they're living more and more urban lives. And this idea of a connection to the land is an idealization. It's a kind of myth that America's created for itself. And these kind of radio shows are playing into that. That's it for this session. I kept it somewhat short because you'll have some podcast episodes to listen to. And I will see you at the next session.